Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a gorgeous day and a lot cooler outside, so we do appreciate your being here with us. And they're doing what they can for us about the air conditioning. But we're going to do a 1-hour book talk with questions with our author, followed by a book signing. The books are available for sale, thanks to the Friends of the Library over there at the table, and she will be happy to personalize them for you. I want to start by thanking the Bremen Museum of Atlanta for working with us on this project. Christy from the Norcross branch of the library, thank you for coming and checking out books. If you are a Gwinnetian and would like a library card, she can accommodate you. I want to thank Dr. Lillian Baxter, the director of the Weinberg Center for the Holocaust Education. We're very grateful to have her come with our author today. And the City of Norcross, who gives us this building, and of course the Friends of the Library, who took care of your refreshments and your book sales. So thank you, everyone. When Tosia Schneider was a young girl, the Nazis invaded her Polish hometown. She packed up her belongings, leaving behind her kitten, and moved to the ghetto. One by one, her father, her mother, and older brother were either killed or died of starvation and disease. She was deported to a labor camp where she spent the remaining years of the Holocaust. She survived the bombing of that camp and in 1944 was liberated by the Russian army, and she moved to the United States. So the story has a happy ending. And she's here today with her husband of 66 years. So it really does have a happy ending. She is here also today to honor her mother's last request, that she must live to tell the world this story. We are so grateful to have her here today to hear that story. Help me welcome Tosia Schneider.
Good afternoon. Without libraries and librarians, what do we have? No past and no future, wrote Red Bradbury. You are the tour guides to all knowledge, and for that we are most grateful. I had the misfortune to live under two most brutal dictators who ever lived. Nazi Germany, books were burned. In Russia, having a forbidden book could land you in Siberia. So keep up the good work and be a shining star unto the world. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Denial, filmed partially in Atlanta at Emory University campus, which pictures the trial of Professor Deborah Lipstadt defending herself against the Holocaust denier, David Irving. Sadly, David Irving is not the only denier. There are thousands and thousands like him around the world. By the way, I prefer to use the Hebrew word Shoah. The word Holocaust comes from the Greek word meaning a burnt offering, the kind that were brought to the temple in Jerusalem in the days of old. The Bible refers to them as Reach Nihoach Ladonai, a pleasing odor unto the Lord. The smokestack of Auschwitz were not a pleasing odor to man or God. The Hebrew word Shoah means destruction, catastrophe, horror, and that surely better describes that period, the terrible period. Shoah is the most documented genocide in history. The Nazis kept very good records, how many trains with how many victims arrived in Auschwitz and other camps, how much cyclone gas was needed to murder innocent men, women, and children. and we, the Jews, right. Before the crematoria in Auschwitz were ever built, 1.5 million men, women, and children were murdered by mass shooting, as the French father Patrick Dubois describes in his book, Holocaust by Bullets. This month, an exhibit opened in Berlin. It was called Mass Shooting, Holocaust from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 1941-44. 722 places where more than 500 people were killed were discovered. Jews lived in Poland for 1,000 years. They were invited to Kiev Bolesław to help with industry and commerce, and this they did indeed. Poland was then, the 16th century, was the golden age of Polish Jewry. Poland was then referred to as Paradisus Judiorum, a Jewish paradise. That paradise turned into a raging inferno in our time. Numbers, even horrifying large numbers, hardly affect us. It is the fate of individuals that stir us deeply. So this afternoon, I will tell you what happened to one family in one little town in Eastern Europe, not because there was anything extraordinary about their life or their fate. On the contrary, what happened to them happened in hundreds and thousands of towns and villages, large and small, in those days. In 1939, I was 11 years old and totally unaware of the gathering storm. My mother, grandmother, uncle, and aunts were vacationing in the Carpathian Mountains. I splashed in a cold mountain brook and saw the world was beautiful and full of promise. In the middle of August, a telegram arrived from my father. These were the days before cell phone and messaging. And he asked us to return home immediately, that the war was imminent. My mother woke us up, we dressed quickly, and walked to the railroad station. On the way, she found a little grocery store. He didn't have very much on his shelf, so she brought all the candies and cookies that he had. And I thought to myself, well, if the war starts like this, it can be terrible after all. I sat on the train and munched on my sweets and couldn't understand why the grown-ups were so worried. Yet at every station we began to see Polish troops moving west to the German border. What we did not know, at the same time, German army troops were moving east, and on their trains were graffiti. We are off to Poland to thrash the Jews. Hundreds of miles from my little town of Horodenka, plans were set in order to destroy and annihilate everything we loved and cherished. When we arrived home, we learned that Germany issued an ultimatum to Poland. The country was mobilizing. My father was too old, my brother too young. Both served in civil defense. September 1st, 1931, war broke out, a day forever inscribed in my memory. Our town was bombed. There were a number of civilian casualties. News from the front was getting worse day by day. Warsaw was bombed and many other cities. Yet on the third day, we felt encouraged. We heard that France and England declared war on Germany. We saw surely the war will not last very long. You would begin to see the Polish government fleeing into exile to Romania. We were very close to the Romanian border. There was discussion at home that perhaps my father and my brother should leave. Surely everyone thought women and children would be safe. Not in our wildest nightmares could we have imagined what was to come. There were no prophets of old to warn us of the impending catastrophe. My parents were steeped in German culture. They spoke the language well. They loved its music and literature. They could not have imagined such barbarity from quote-unquote civilized nation, the crown jewel of European culture. September 17, Poland fell. Russian trucks rumbled in our city streets, and the Soviet occupation began. We did know that we understood that it was preferable to the German occupation. After a few weeks, schools reopened. We children had to learn a new language, Russian, new alphabet, Cyrillic alphabet, and a great deal of communist propaganda. We were told that we live in the best of all possible worlds under the leadership of the great Stalin. But the reality on the ground was quite different. We heard the rumble of trucks in the night as community leaders, religious leaders, both Jews and Gentiles, were exiled to Siberia. Little did we know, though, that exile to the frozen wasteland of Siberia was much preferable to what awaited us all. Of the 10% of Polish Jews who survived the Shoah, the greatest number survived in Russia. On June 22nd, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and we were at war again. There were battles in the city, and again, a number of civilian casualties. During the few days of the interregnum, Ukrainian nationalists declared an independent Ukraine. The Ukrainian state did not last very long. After the Germans arrived, they had no intention of creating independent Ukraine. The first group to enter our occupied town were Hungarians. They were German allies. We began to see Hungarian Jews being driven through our town in the most deplorable condition. Many of them left their babies and young children with our community. We heard only later that most of them were massacred in Ukraine. On July 41, Germans occupied our town, and the reign of terror began. They thrashed our beautiful synagogue and burned the Torah scrolls and the prayer books. They dragged out the rabbi who lived nearby, beat him mercilessly, and asked him to dance for them. They erected 8 gallows in the city center, randomly selected 8 Jews and hung them. And we were told that if we don't follow all the orders, that that's going to happen to everyone. And here are some of the proclamations. All Jewish men from the age of 14 to 60 must register for forced labor. All Jews must wear a white armband with the Star of David on it. And here the Nazis miscalculated somewhat. This was surely a passport to death, but it was never a badge of shame for us. We love that symbol, and today it graces the flag of Israel, a free Jewish state in 2,000 years. Jewish children cannot go to school. As I saw some of my fellow students walking to school, I ran to my mother and asked her, why can't I go? I was a pretty good student and well-behaved child. Never forget the pain in her eyes she could not explain. Not only could her children not go to school, but she couldn't do what she loved best, to teach. Jews cannot enter stores. Jews cannot socialize with Christians. Jewish doctors and lawyers cannot practice their profession. All radios, gold, silver, and precious things that you have had to be turned over to the German authorities. I had a coat with a little fur collar and muff, and I angrily ripped it off, and I wondered if the Germans needed to keep them warm in the Siberian winter as they fought the Russians. Needless to say, anything that any German liked, your house or anything in it, was his for the taking. This was the largest robbery in theory perpetrated in broad daylight by a standing government. My grandmother was an Orthodox lady. She refused to part with her Sabbath candlesticks. And so in the dark of night, as all the children and grandchildren stood around, they were buried in a garden in the hopes that one of us will be able to survive and retrieve him. The unrelenting terror, night and day, is difficult to describe. Those of you who must have seen perhaps the movie Shoah or Schindler's List have an idea of what the roundups were like. If you had the misfortune to run into a German on your city street, you had to get off the sidewalk on the road, take off your hat and bow. If you came alive from the encounter, it was pure chance. People were beaten, dogs were trained to attack them. Sabbaths and the holidays were the worst of time. This is when most of the roundups and most of the killings occurred. My father continued to work in the mill as before, and he told us that his German supervisor, Mr. Miller, was a pretty decent man. Yet one evening, he came to our house with his orderly, and I slept in the next room, and I saw a German in uniform standing over me, mumbling something, my golden angel, my golden angel. I didn't understand what he was saying. My brother came to the bedroom, had me dressed quickly, and whisked me off to my grandmother's house. The next day, I heard the terror that my parents endured that night. Mr. Miller put a gun to my mother's head, and he wanted her to confess that by dieser ist ein Arier gewesen, that I must have been fathered by an Aryan, just simply because I had blonde hair at the time. As winter approached, starvation took toll in the ghetto. The rations were very small, and we began to see children with swollen stomach begging on the city streets. My grandmother opened a soup kitchen. My father still lived in the mill, and my father could barter us for some provisions. My mother initially tried to normalize our life as much as she could. She assembled a few of my friends and had regular study classes in the back room of the house, which was strictly forbidden under the threat of death to teach Jewish children. And so we studied math and science and poetry and literature. Years later, I wondered, why didn't she teach us how to make Molotov cocktails? Not that I knew, I'm sure she didn't know how. Then I realized how wise she was. She wanted us to believe that scholarship mattered. She wanted us to believe that there was still a future for us. Yet one by one, my friends disappeared. Actually, a silly euphemism, they were murdered. Rumors were flying that the Sonderkommandos, this death squad, were operating in our region, and that they were coming our way. Christopher Browning, in his book Ordinary Men, described this group of mass killers, the Reserve Battalion 101 of the German Order Police, which were recruited in Hamburg, Germany. These people were too old to serve in the army, but they were young enough and brave enough to murder innocent men, women, and children. Within days of coming to our area, they became Hitler's willing executioners. The commander, Doppler, came to the Jewish Community Center, And he told us that if people give him 5 kilograms of gold and other precious jewels, that our city would be spared. But our city was not spared. Friday, December 4, 1941, an order was issued that all Jews must gather in front of the large synagogue to be inoculated against typhus. Many people, like my father, were skeptical. Yet the doctor in town, Dr. Schneider, no relation, told us that he was given hypodermic needles in order to assemble nurses, and it was all perfectly legitimate. My father, being skeptical, hid us in the attic of the mill where he worked. Those people who came to the assembly point, they were herded into the synagogue. They were kept there for 2 days and 2 nights without food or water, and then driven away in trucks. After shouting and the guns silent, we returned home to the ghetto to find the whole family assembled, except for my beautiful, tall, redheaded Aunt Mincha. Her 3 children were crying. Her husband was desolate. My grandmother, the pillar of strength for us all at the time, tried to reassure everyone. She told us that we will try to find out where these people were taken. They will send my aunt warm clothing and food, and perhaps we can even buy her freedom. We went to bed somewhat reassured, only to wake up next day and find out the terror, that destruction of our city. 2,500 men, women, and children were driven in trucks to a nearby forest of Shemakowce, and there they were machine gunned. They were forced to disrobe in a barn, approached the ravine in groups of 5 when they were shot. The music was playing to muffle the sound of the shots as far people were murdered. The next day, the Gestapo chief Toppler came to the Jewish Community Center, and he demanded 2,500 marks for the bullets spent killing the Jews. Public mourning was forbidden. Any Jewish man found unshaven, as our custom of 7 days was mourning, was severely beaten or shot. The clothes they collected from the victims, the best, were sent to Germany. The rest, Jewish women, washed and cleaned, and they were sold on the city streets. I'll never forget the face of a friend of ours who came in sobbing. He just recognized the dress that his wife wore on that terrible day. After the action, the Commander Doppler came to the Jewish Community Center, and he said if we provide him with whatever it is that he desires and work very hard, no more destruction, no more actions will occur. What we did not know, that on January 20, 1942, the top Nazi officials sat around the table in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, and there planned the final solution, the annihilation of all the Jews. These were not some creatures from a distant planet. These were barbarians with PhDs. The noose was being put tighter. Our people felt trapped and abandoned, and the world was silent. We learned later that world leaders were fully aware of the atrocities perpetrated against the Jews, but chose to keep silent as well. Some young people tried to flee across the border to Romania. Some tried to get false papers and disappear in large cities. Many met their deaths by being denounced to the Gestapo. Others fled to the woods and joined partisans. Many of them lie in unmarked graves and lonely fields. Everyone built a bunker, a hiding place in their home, so that my father, it was a small little area on our attic disguised by a bookshelf. Not unlike the one I saw not many years ago in Amsterdam, where the family of Anne Frank was hidden. We used to go to sleep only partially undressed, and before dawn, try to make our way to the shelter. I remember being carried half asleep by my father to that shelter. If the sun rose and the Gestapo didn't arrive in the town, we went down, and another day in the ghetto began. Passover, April 12th, another second akcja took place in our town. Once again, the chilling screams, Judenraus, Jews out, were heard throughout the ghetto. For 2 days, people were rounded up, and those who were caught were brought to the railroad station and loaded into cattle cars. Once again, our father hid us in the attic of the mill. We sat there among the sacks of grain and flour, listening to the gunshot and the screams all around us. I remember being awakened the second day by the most plain whistle of a locomotive. I didn't know that on the train bound for Belzec was my dearest childhood friend, Genya Rice. And by the way, Belzec was not like Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, you went to the right or to the left to work or to the gas chambers. In Belzec, within 24 hours, everyone was murdered. Genya had brown curls. She loved American comic books. And she always insisted that one day she will be a great singer in New York, no less. I could never top that one. We used to wear Shirley Temple rings. Do we still know who Shirley Temple was? We played with Shirley Temple cutout dolls. Genya was 12 years old. Her whole family, her parents and her 2 brothers were killed as well. We assembled in our grandmother's house and counted our losses. On the train bound for Belzec was my uncle Nathan Rosenbaum, his son Max 13, cousin Visha 19. I will never forget the battered face of my cousin. He jumped from the moving train and returned back to the ghetto. He did not survive the war. I do not know what his last days were. The third akcja, the third roundup, occurred in September 1942. It lasted 3 days, and again, those who were caught were herded into cattle cars on their way to Belzec. Our town was declared Judenrein, free of Jews, and so it's still today. Orodenka, the Jewish shtetl, the Jewish little town, is no more. The survivors had to leave to neighboring ghettos within 24 hours, and a pitiful remnant of our community went to the neighboring ghettos. For the last time, we gathered in my grandmother's house, and the family decided that the most merciful thing to do was to give my grandmother a lethal injection, bury her with honor next to my grandfather, and spare her all the horror of yet another ghetto starvation and horror. As we sat in the living room, tears running down our faces, we loved our babcia very much. Suddenly, the door opened as my uncle left her bedroom, sobbing and apologizing to us. He just could not do it. Even then, he could not become a mercy killer. Yet he gave each one of us a very precious gift, a poison pill, even to the children. We only had to promise that we will never use it except for extreme situations. So my frail grandmother and other old and sick people were put on a horse-drawn wagon to the neck ghetto of Colombia. The rest of the people had to run at gunpoint. The Gestapo on horses beat them mercilessly. Only a handful of people were allowed to remain in our town, 60 people. Those the Germans declared Wertvolle, people that they knew that needed for work. My father was among them, but he couldn't keep my mother and my brother and me with them. And so we arrived in the ghetto of Tluste. That winter, my mother made the last attempt to try to save my life. She met a man from Russia who took my cousin on false papers, and he said, get her ready in 2 days. She should meet me at the railroad station. I will take her to a remote village to a friend of mine, and I will tell him that she is my cousin. My mother was overjoyed. At least one of her children will have a chance to survive. And so for the next 2 days, she taught me how to behave in church. She taught me catechism. She, as a teacher in Polish public school, was there when the priest came to instruct the children. And so she was familiar with all that. And every time my resolve waned, she kept repeating over and over again, someone must survive to tell the world. And so it is the title of my memoir in English. It was published in France as well. As the evening came, I said goodbye to my mother, took off my armband, and we walked together to the edge of the ghetto. I was supposed to sneak my way out and meet this gentleman at the railroad station. And suddenly it became clear to me more than ever that I'll never see her again. And why would I want to live in a world where our people were so brutally murdered? And I told her that I'm not going. And to this day, I am very grateful she did not insist. Even so, I was only 14 years old. The final decision had to be mine. And so I had a few more precious weeks with her. That winter, at the age of 39, she died of starvation and disease. I had a raging fever and don't remember very much of that winter. We were left all alone, 4 children, 2 cousins, my brother and I. Yet my brother told me that my recovery was due to a miracle of the eggs, as he said. A Polish man who at one time worked with my father in egg export brought eggs. And that was the only nutrition that we really had. But more than sustenance, he brought a light of human kindness in that world of darkness and despair. I tried to find him after the war, but could not. I was delirious a long time. No doctor ever saw me. There was no medicine, no food, no clean water. I was terribly weak for quite a while. Yet in summer 1943, my brother and I were taken to forced labor at Lisovce. I pretended that I was 18. We were housed in barracks. We worked in the field. The work was difficult, but in an open field, I could always find something edible. We didn't starve as badly as we did in the ghetto. On July 21, 1943, we were working outdoors at a threshing machine. My group was resting at a haystack. My brother was working the night shift. Near me was a woman and 2 children she was hiding in the camp. Children were strictly forbidden in the camp. Before dawn, shots were hit all around us. One shot hit the little girl in the foot. She was bleeding profusely, whimpering. The Gestapo men told us to get up and go to the assembly point. When we got there, there were a number of people sitting there with their hands behind their backs, and men were asked to dig grave. Suddenly, our commander, Frank, arrived on a horse and screamed at the Gestapo that he needed us to complete the harvest, that they can come after the harvest and kill us all. The Gestapo left, and we proceeded to collect our fallen comrades. And among them was my brother Julek, 17. During the days that followed, I was in a haze. I wandered aimlessly. I did not go to work. I really didn't want to continue. Yet one day, as I was walking, I saw the black boots in front of me, and I saw that that was the end I really longed for. It was our commander, Frank. He asked me how old I was, and he told me to go to his villa and tell the cook to give me food and clean clothes. I didn't realize then that he was a pretty decent man and tried to be as helpful as he could. And so that summer, I worked in the attic of his villa, knitting sweaters that he sent to his family in Germany. And there I met a girl my age, Fritschka. And just being with her brought me back to life a little more. News of the ghetto uprising in Warsaw lifted our spirits. The bitter winter of 1943, we worked outdoors without gloves, stockings, and wooden shoes. And sub-zero, the Polish winters. Fritzka and I shared the same bunk. We shared every scrap of food we can find. And one day morning when I was getting ready to go to work, I realized that she was burning up. I didn't need a medical diagnosis to know that she had typhus. I went outside and got some snow to cool her forehead and went to work. At noon, shots were heard in the compound, and I knew that Fritschka was no more. A friend told me that he was asked to put her shoes on, and she said, "Where I'm going, I don't need any shoes." With a head-held eye, she walked outside the cabin where she was shot. Only dirty brown stain remained in the snow. Fritschka was 15 years old. The Gestapo regularly went through our camp, and anybody who was sick, unable to work, was shot. The news of the German defeat at Stalingrad renewed our will to go on, to see that evil empire destroyed. On March 1944, quite unexpectedly, Russian troops liberated our camp. Yet before we had a chance to take one breath of free air, 8 Germans took up planes, flew over the barracks and threw incendiary bombs, and people who tried to flee from the burning barracks machine gunned from the air. The Nazis didn't want any witnesses to the horror they perpetrated. One of the most severely wounded was a young woman we called the Nightingale. I tried to reassure her and told her we'll take her to the Russian field hospital and we'll get help for her. But all she said, "Hold my hand a little longer. For me, it is too late." And indeed, her beautiful voice was stilled forever. V-Day, Victory Day, did not bring much rejoicing. Surely we were glad that the carnage has stopped. It was only then we began to realize our losses, the extent of our losses. I'm the only survivor of 14 members of my immediate family and many more distant relatives. we began to understand how great the tragedy befell our people. A third world Jewry was murdered. Great institutions of learning, poets, writers were no more. The survivors had to live with one of the most painful accusations made by ignorant people. They walked like sheep to slaughter. No one ever accused that 500,000 Russian prisoners of war killed by the Germans of cowardice, or the 20,000 Polish officers shot in the Katyn forest by the Russians. Yet somehow the world expected a civilian uprising from defenseless civilian population. And resist they did. The first civilian uprising was in the Warsaw Ghetto. There, the starved, isolated, and poorly armed members of the Jewish Defense Organization fought valiantly, knowing full well that victory or survival were impossible. They fought to die with honor. They held out longer than the whole country of Poland with a standing army, air force, and world support. They held out longer than Imagine Lion. There was resistance in camps. A crematorium was blown up in Auschwitz. There was resistance in Sobibor and Treblinka. Our partisans fought in forests and fields. News reached us repeatedly of battlefields, outnumbered and outgunned. Few survived to tell the tale. Jews joined resistance movements in every occupied country in Europe, in France, Belgium, Italy, Yugoslavia. They fought in the Jewish Brigade in the British Army. For the survivors lay a long and difficult road to find our way in the world and to learn to live a normal life again. The famous Russian poetess Anna Akhmatova wrote at the side of the mass grave in Babi Yar, Ukraine, "I would like to call you all by name, but they have lost the list. I did not lose the list. It is inscribed on my heart with a steel, with a searing iron. L'chol ish yesh shem, every human being has a name," proclaimed the popular Hebrew song. The Nazis robbed our people of their names and branded numbers on their arms. We ask, where were the world leaders, the scholars, the theologians? Why was their silence so deafening? The Shoah could have been prevented, but for the world indifference. We must understand that hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism lead to the gates of Auschwitz. Abraham Foxman, the chairman of the Anti-Defamation League, reminded us recently that the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz did not begin with bricks, they began with words. As our days are dwindling, we leave our memories in your hands. Preserve them and pass them on to yet another generation. Thank you. I think we are open for questions. If anybody has any, please don't hesitate. Yes?
I would like to thank you for your moving
Excuse me, you have to speak louder. My hearing is not very well.
I would like to thank you for your moving and personal story. Last June, I visited a concentration camp in Poland, and it was the most difficult day of my life. I visited Stutthof, and I can't tell you the emotion that it brought to me as a Jew, but I felt as a Jew that I had to go. I was on vacation and it was one of these stops. And I thank you so much for bringing your personal story.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this. Yeah.
I would like to know what you did immediately following once you were freed from the camp. How did you find your way over here to America?
It was a long journey. First of all, I knew that even though the Soviets liberated me, I didn't want to live under the Soviet Union. So I made my way to Poland first, because our area was occupied by the Russians. There I met my future husband, who was my first English teacher. And now he complains I talk back. But anyway, eventually I made my way to Germany and lived in Fürth in Nuremberg. And I did attend one of the Nuremberg trials. And it was quite an incredible thing for me to sit there and watch these murderers just pass by there, horror they caused in the world. I had a cousin in Peekskill, New York, and she sent me the papers. So in 1941, I came as a Marine Flesher to the United States. And let me tell you, standing on that ship and seeing for the first time the Statue of Liberty, it was really a most moving and wonderful feeling. Yes? Mm-hmm.
In, I guess, 1947, my parents were looking for a place to rent in New York City. It was after the war. They met during the war. And housing was, very short, very limited.
You need to speak up or come closer because I really don't have very good hearing.
That's okay. They were looking for housing. They were looking for a place to live in New York City.
Yeah.
And they searched and searched, and housing was great shortage back then.
Yes, I remember.
And there was one couple who took them in, and they had a son at the time, my eldest brother. And it was a Jewish couple, and they were from Germany. And they'd lost all of their family at Auschwitz. And I remember my mother saying they had a choice. They chose to live and go forward. And they took my parents in when no one else would, and they became family to them. And so my question to you, my mother always says you have a choice. And she said they chose to live. How did you make that decision? Was it a conscious decision for you?
No, it was very difficult. I remember very well the day, V-Day. Was still under Russian occupation. There was music blaring all over the city. And I suddenly realized this is it, and I'm left all alone. It was very difficult. It took years and years to come to terms with it. Once I had my own family, I have 3 sons and 5 grandchildren. But let me tell you the first day in America. As I mentioned, my husband was my first English teacher, and then in Germany we were studying Shakespeare and Chaucer, and I thought that I knew English more or less well. I come down for the first breakfast, and the radio was blaring. So I speak with my cousin, still Polish, and suddenly I ask her, what's going on? I'm in America the first day, and all I hear is Jews and Jews and Jews. What do they want from the Jews? She started laughing and crying. It was advertising for orange juice. So my study of Shakespeare didn't help me at all with the Yankee English. But it took a while to feel that not every policeman on the corner is going to arrest you. And, it took a while to feel to be a free person again.
What made you decide
decide to go to America as opposed to going to Israel?
Very simple, I couldn't. There were shlichim, people who came from Israel. I went through the medical exam, and they said, we will call you when we can get transportation, ships to go. As you know, the British stopped most of the refugees to enter Palestine at the time. And then there was the Berlin Wall, and everyone was sure the war will start again in Europe. Actually, some years later, when I read the biography of Truman, he too expressed the idea that there might be a war in Europe. And the last thing I wanted to be is to caught in Europe in another war. So when I got papers to come to America, I did. But my first choice was really going to Palestine at that time. I visited there many times, and I always love to be there. Yeah. Okay, we have just 5 more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, please. Yes.
Did you pursue a career when you came to America?
I taught Hebrew for many years here in Atlanta at the temple. Yes, Barbara? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have a relative that was hidden by a Christian family in Holland, but she would never speak of the atrocities or anything that went on. She would never even speak to her children. The family kept her, as I said, for years.
Right.
And when the war was over, their son married. But this woman would never speak about anything.
Yeah, there are people like that who are simply incapable, unwilling to do it. That's okay. For me, to speak out, number one, is simply to keep a promise. And number two, that people realize how a country like Germany, the crown jewel of European culture, could descend in such barbarity. How precious our liberties are here in this country, and how we must defend them. Because it can happen anywhere if people don't realize that they have to fight against this. Yes, Barb?
What made you finally decide to write your memoir? Because I know you've only had it out for a few years.
Somebody asked me how long it took me to write, and I said some 70 years. From day one I knew I had to do it, but it was always later. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And suddenly I realized I was close to 80, and I better do it or it won't be done. So that was really, right. Yes.
Given today's political and cultural climate in the States, what would you like my generation and younger generations to know in terms of how to prevent this atrocity from ever happening again?
Just exactly what I said, to be mindful of all the people in this country and treat them the same well. We're all human beings. We all want the same, to live in freedom and to protect those freedoms, because democracies can be destroyed as well. So be mindful of it and treat everyone as a human being, worth to live in freedom, to live in a democracy. We must remember that. Well,
I just want to say that I'm a Christian, that I'm so proud that you took the opportunity to write this book, because I've been to parts of Poland and I've been to some of these places. I walked through the Schindler's Factory,
right.
and I've been to Israel and seen the Holocaust Museum, and we cannot forget this. We have to pass it on to the next generation. And you people writing the books and testifying, it makes it more real to us to pass on to the next generation. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that very much.